the Federal Reserve has once again raised interest rates 0.25%. And this was the expectation, but with the recent instability with our banking system, there was a question about possibly the Federal Reserve holding off on another 0.25% increase. But indeed, they have gone through with it. And I want to show you kind of within the context of this action and then the broader discussion surrounding it, a couple clips of Elizabeth Warren raising an important concern when it comes to these interest rate hikes, and then get into another important conversation about inflation generally, because of course that's what's being addressed here with these interest rate hikes, and a big part of it that is under-discussed, a big cause of inflation that is under-discussed, as we'll get to in a little bit. But first, here's Elizabeth Warren. This is on Face the Nation on Sunday before the interest rate hike, so she's expecting them but encouraging the Federal Reserve not to take that action, and then we'll look at after her reaction.
No, I do not think he should raise rates. But look, I want a full disclosure here. I've been in the camp for a long time that these extraordinary rate increases that he has taken on, these extreme rate increases, are something that he should not be doing.
Why?
And the reason for that is twofold.
Yeah.
Well, twofold. The first is to remind Chair Powell he has a dual mandate. Yes, he is responsible for dealing with inflation, but he is also responsible for employment. And what Chair Powell is trying to do, and he has said fairly explicitly, is that they are trying to, in effect, slow down the economy so that, this is by the Fed's own estimate, 2 million people will lose their jobs. And I believe that is not what the chair of the Federal Reserve should be doing. I want to make a second point on inflation as well, though. There are other drivers of the cost increase. For example, price gouging, supply chain kinks, the war in Ukraine. Raising interest rates doesn't do anything to solve those problems. All it does, at least by the way the chair wants to do this, is put millions of people out of work.
So it is a profoundly reasonable thing to be bringing up, and we'll get to more as far as details go on this front in a little bit, that if some of the major drivers of inflation aren't actually things that raising interest rates are going to be effective at addressing, then the interest rates could be doing more harm than good, at least how aggressive these interest rate hikes have been. Second moment here after the news that they indeed are raising interest rates another 0.25%, and her reaction.
Get 2 million people laid off, and one of the things that we need to understand, he wants to raise the unemployment rate by more than a point within a single 12-month period. We have done that before in this country. In fact, we have done it 12 times before. And out of all 12 times, how many times has it resulted in a recession? The answer is 12. So that's the direction he's trying to push this. That is a danger to our economy. It's why I said 5 years ago, I think he's a dangerous man to have in this job.
And she has been consistently outspoken when it comes to Jerome Powell as the chair of the Federal Reserve. So with that being said, definitely concerning that maybe the Fed is going to overdo it here and end up causing a recession, end up hurting a lot of people when it comes to their jobs. But what I also want to look at, as I mentioned, is some of what's driving, a massive part of what's driving inflation that is all too often ignored by many of our leaders, political and otherwise, and that's corporate profits, and more specifically, price gouging when it comes to the pursuit of these corporate profits. And so we've talked about this a little bit in the past. I remember Katie Porter nicely highlighted this during one of her, visuals and her explanation on that front. But here is this from the Economic Policy Institute looking at numbers from 2020 and 2021. Strikingly, over half of this increase, 53.9%, can be attributed to fatter profit margins, with labor costs contributing less than 8% of this increase. This is not normal. From 1979 to 2019, profits only contributed about 11% to price growth and labor costs over 60%, as shown in figure A below. So when you look at the comparison between past times, what was driving inflation, compared to this period of time more recently, it is significant how much of it, 53.9%, is driven by corporate profits, meaning they weren't just increasing prices to match inflation, but way going overboard and making record profits, as we talked about generally and within the context of particular industries where the profits are just off the charts. And that is a clear sign that it is beyond what was necessary. It's beyond what was even just proportional to the profits they were making before, and instead is causing price increases that just aren't necessary. So when you look at that and you look at the supply chain problems, as was also mentioned by Elizabeth Warren, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all the different economic effects of that. And I mentioned supply chain, but let us not forget that it's not a logistically easy to recover from thing when you just turn off the light switch to an economy, a global economy, the way that we did with our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Not to say that that wasn't necessary. It was, in having to very much cut back on activities and cut back on things that drive economic activity. But because of that, the recovery in terms of supply chains, and then you add on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you add on the absurd price increases from corporations to make themselves record profits, and then you put us in a situation where we see this inflation. Now, the good news is we've seen pretty consistently inflation falling. And so if that continues, and if the Federal Reserve doesn't end up creating a reality where they've gone too overboard and we see a recession, then we could get back to kind of normal economic times, good economic times in terms of the metrics that we use. But definitely a lot of things at play here. And I wish there was more of a focus from especially our political leaders on the price gouging that's been going on and how that has played a massive role. And it's not, workers are making too much money. That's the real problem, as seems to be the sentiment far too often. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to be a part of what makes this show possible, plus get access to the full video version of the show hours before all the clips are uploaded to YouTube, plus get the extra bonus show on Saturdays, you can do so by going to lukebeasleyshow.com/membership. That's lukebeasleyshow.com/membership. Link in the description.